Hi, everyone. Welcome to Talk Back. It's November 14th, and we're in the middle of very turbulent times. And when that happens, I always want to talk to someone who's an expert who can give us a perspective on what's happening on the history. Of course, I'm talking about the Israeli-Hamas war, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that we've been struggling with for many years. And today in Washington, there's a march by people from Jewish communities and other communities all over the country. Let's see how that works out. But I'm very glad to have with me someone to help make some sense of it or help explain it for us. And he is Professor Alan Dowty. He's in Washington State now. Good afternoon for us, Alan. How are you today?
Very well, thank you.
Okay, so you're in Washington State, but before we start chatting about what's happening, I want to let people know something about your background and your history. Alan is a professor. He taught at Hebrew University in Jerusalem between 1963 and 1975. He then went to Notre Dame in 1975, retired from there. He's a professor emeritus. He held the Kahanoff Chair in Israel Studies at the University of Calgary. He was president of the Association for Israel Studies. He's published 7 books. One of them that we've read, Israel Palestine, now in its 3rd edition. He's delivered over 500 public lectures in 20 countries, and he was a visiting professor, a visiting fellow at the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies at Oxford University, and now he's speaking to us from Washington State. So, Alan, you've been following, of course, everything that's happening. And before we get into the history and the background that brings us to today's date, let's talk about the American Jewish community and its response to what's happening in Israel and the march today. What are your thoughts about that, how the American Jewish community has responded?
Well, of course, the American Jewish community is just as almost, I would say, as disturbed by all of this as as Israel itself, and it reveals the same divisions within the community, which is no surprise, because obviously Israelis are divided among themselves, and the same divisions are reflected on this side of the ocean. It's interesting that there is, on this side of the ocean, some feeling that it's not the time to criticize the government of Israel. I would just point out that Israelis have no problem whatsoever in distinguishing between loyalty to the state, to the interests of the country, and criticism of a particular policymaker. So it's good to see that people on this side are also learning to make that distinction.
Right. Well, it's interesting. I don't know if this is accurate, but I was watching the news earlier today as the marchers came from all over the country to DC, and Eric Fingerhut, who is the head of the National Federation, Jewish Federations, he said that he just saw a poll that showed that 82% of Americans, not just American Jews, were in support of Israel. That's a pretty high number. But he also talked about the 400% rise in anti-Semitic
Yeah.
incidents around the country. What's your thought about that?
Well, the sympathy for Israel is in line with general public support of Israel throughout most of its history. That I don't find too surprising, particularly since the evangelical community in recent decades has come to be such a strong support for Israel. As for the other divisions in the American Jewish community, again, I would emphasize that it's important to understand that people can disagree on many of the particulars and yet see them pulled together as they are today in Washington.
Yeah. So I heard someone say or read that today in Israel, notwithstanding the terrible disruptions when they were protesting about Netanyahu's plan about the changing the Supreme Court's role in Israel, that today in Israel there are no doves, there are only hawks. How do you respond to that? Do you think that that is true while the war is going on?
Well, I think it's absolutely true on the level of people getting behind the country, the army. The same people who were in the streets protesting every weekend for the last several months are reported for duty and are now serving. And yes, the country is certainly unified in responding to the atrocities of October 7th. But at the same time, and again, I come back to the distinction that Israelis have no problem making between their loyalty to the state and their belief in what Israel stands for, and what they consider to be the mistakes of particular policymakers that got them into this situation in the first place. And so you may have seen some of the recent poll numbers that if elections were held today, there
Yeah.
would be a radical change. Now, Israelis have no problem with that. They can
Right.
levy the worst criticism imaginable against particular leaders, and distinguish quite readily between that and the effort as a country to resolve this issue.
Yes. Well, of course, in America, we have that similar divide, but there are also people more on the strident left to take on what Human Rights Watch has said about Israel uh, being an apartheid state, committing war crimes. And then I want you to talk about the genesis. You're a professor, you've been on campuses all over the world. What is the genesis of the youth being so, in so many instances, pro-Palestinian and more than just anti-Israel or anti-Zionist, almost anti-Semitic of what's happening in campuses around the country today. Why?
Well, I think this is something that is worth discussing. And at the same time, I would point out that it really involves just one particular Jewish group, which essentially you see has simply joined the other side. I mean, they've become pro Palestinian, and that pretty much describes their overall program. This is a group that was just suspended, in fact, at Columbia because of their refusal to abide by the rules for protest and so on there. So I wouldn't. I would suggest we not make too much of that. I think most people who are uh, quite critical of the Israeli government within the Jewish community are at the same time, participating in the march today and otherwise joining the effort to defeat Hamas.
Do you think what we've seen much more than just protesting on the university campuses, we've seen actual assaults against Jewish students. So some Jewish students feel threatened, uh, they feel intimidated, and they feel that the university administrations are not doing enough to protect them and to speak out, not against genuine protest, a genuine dialogue and discussion, which is what a university should do, but downright threats and violence. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think some of the universities have been fairly slow to react to that. I can recount a little bit of what I experienced here at the University of Washington in Seattle. that the students expressed quite a bit of concern, open hostility, no assaults that I know of, but certainly they were experiencing a lot of harassment and so on. And the Jewish Studies Center here has instituted a program for people to drop in and talk to each other and otherwise get some comfort. And I gave a talk yesterday at the Middle East Center at the university, and most Middle East centers are not noted for being particularly sympathetic to Israel from the nature of things. As you can understand, most of the experts there are experts on the Arab world. But everything went very peacefully and in good order. So I was quite relieved, naturally a little bit apprehensive ahead of the talk, but I think the universities, from what I can tell, are beginning to get ahead of this. You're right that the initial response was very feeble in some places in terms of defending students against harassment and even assault.
What about the transformation of some of our young Jewish high school and college people who have become more pro-Palestinian in quite a virulent way, anti-Israel, anti-Zionist themselves. Do you think there is somewhat of a failure of education? Have our young people, and I'm talking about our responsibility in the Jewish community to educate our youth, do you think we failed to give them the proper perspective and history background about what is going on?
Uh, I don't think there's been a failure on the part of the education. I think there's a couple of things at work here. One is that the this element in the Jewish community was already there, and it's true in Israel too. I mean, there are people there who are essentially just pro-Palestinian, not in huge numbers, but that part of the community has always been there. And the second is that the ongoing occupation of the West Bank and in the past of Gaza is something that over time gets harder and harder to come to terms with. And the lack of progress on the diplomatic front and the ongoing demands of Palestinians and so on begin to make more of an impact, which doesn't necessarily lead to people becoming totally, just switching sides essentially, but does lead to more criticism, which I think the state of Israel ought to be able to deal with. I mean, there are plenty of there's plenty of it within the state of Israel itself, for that matter.
Well, you see, I mean, it's a little bit of a contradiction. People talk about Israel as an occupier and not granting rights and self-determination, but Israel itself is a vibrant democracy. Look at the way hundreds of thousands of peoples marched, not just once, but almost daily in the streets against Netanyahu, against the government, and they were uh, allowed to do that. And it's a democracy that allows people to do that, right?
Well, yes, and I think in this instance, Hamas made a very bad miscalculation. They
Mm,
apparently thought that because Israel was racked by these protests for several months, that this had weakened Israel, and you hear some statements by leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah that this shows that Israel is rotting from the inside and so on, and they are dead wrong about that. Israel is a very vibrant country, both politically and in other ways as well. And what happened with the Hamas attack was that the country pulled together in a really, I mean, the planes were coming back full of people military age who were
right,
reporting for duty and so on. And all the protesters reported for duty.
right,
As I said, this is a bad miscalculation on the part of Hamas.
right. So I mean, other factors that we'll get into that you've talked about are in play, but they figured, as you said, that Israel may have been distracted or divided because of the protests against Netanyahu's Supreme Court plans, and also feared the new alliance, perhaps between Saudi Arabia and the West and Israel. And you think that those were some of the factors that made Hamas act when they did?
Well, yes, the whole background here of normalization, that's the phrase that they use, normalization of the position of Israel in the Middle East. Well, first of all, people sometimes forget to mention, Israel has peace treaties with two of its neighbors covering 80% of its land frontiers. So there's normalization, if you want a good example. And then the other states that have established diplomatic relations over the last 3 or 4 years, part of a trend which obviously was a concern for Hamas and groups like it, Hezbollah and the others. They want to put a stop to this. And the ongoing negotiations with Saudi Arabia, that the Saudis would get an American security guarantee in return for normalizing relations with Israel, that is on hold for the moment. In that respect, Hamas has temporarily succeeded. Now, again, once the fighting is over, once maybe we've made some progress on a broader Palestinian solution that includes Gaza in it, then this process, I would predict, will resume, that we will get back to it, because there's some very important strategic factors behind it. The threat of Iran to states in the Gulf, including, of course, Saudi Arabia. And so on, this was something that isn't going to change. It'll be postponed. It'll be delayed by this war. But the war will be over at some point, and presumably Hamas won't be a factor anymore. Politically, they'll probably still be a factor. They can operate outside of Gaza, and they'll probably operate still on some level within the West Bank and Gaza. But at the same time, it will open the way for this process to resume.
So before we go on more to the origins of this that you were very prescient about, we'll get to that. Just want to touch on the role of social media and again the world's reaction. So on October 7th, I think the world had Israel in its sympathies. And as things proceeded and as the Israeli invasion presented itself, things have changed. The role of social media is turning against Israel. What are your thoughts about that? For example, just today, what's happening in the hospital in Hamas, where I hear the Israeli minister, who is the aide to Netanyahu, saying that we are offering incubators for the children in the prenatal unit, in the natal units. We are offering free passage for them, but the Hamas is not allowing it. We are offering fuel so that for their generators so they can run the hospitals. And of course, the Hamas says no. Alan, what's your analysis of the way the social media is handling these issues and who's telling the truth and who isn't telling the truth here?
Well, social media have always been a problem as a source of disinformation. I think it's a much broader problem than just what we're dealing with now. And you could find a number of examples where the false information has overwhelmed the scientific facts on things like vaccines and so on. I mean, this is a general problem with the social media. And Hamas, having been through these exercises before, where they sent rockets into Israel, Israel responded with airstrikes, and there were inevitably civilian casualties, and they've become really very good at publicizing the casualties inflicted on their own people. I think in a rather cynical kind of way. I mean, this is what they mean by using human shields. And they obviously were very well prepared for that. The news photographers and others had access to the places they wanted them to see. And on the Israeli side, the atrocities basically took place within one day, on the first day. And after that, it became old news. So, on the other hand, the casualties on the Palestinian side are going on day by day. So there's a built-in kind of uh, disadvantage here for Israel in the ongoing things that can be publicized to put pressure on the other side.
Yeah. And is the general truth that Hamas does not want the Palestinians to leave, that they do build their munitions factories and equipment underneath hospitals and other civilian places? Is that all true?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question about it. By locating important facilities under or even in schools, hospitals, and so on, they figured that these would be less likely to be directly attacked. There's no secret about that. This has been their open strategy from the beginning.
And people will ask, why don't the Egyptians allow Palestinians in as a refuge? Why don't the Jordanians allow Palestinians as refuge? What's the genesis of that?
Well, in those two cases, and even others like Lebanon, they
Mm.
have their own internal political considerations, and the last thing many of these countries need is another problematic group that is particularly, for example, the more radical Hamas people fleeing from Gaza into Egypt. Egypt is fighting its own war against Islamic extremists in Sinai. And they've been not formally, but certainly informally, working together with Israel against all of these groups. Egypt is no supporter of Hamas. And so they are very reluctant, understandably, to accept large number of Palestinians into their, and that's been true since, for that matter, since 48, when they
Mm.
occupied Gaza in the first place. The refugees went to Syria, they went to Jordan, they went to Lebanon. They did not go to Egypt.
Mm.
Egyptians did not want another problematic group on their territory. The Lebanese were not in a position to do much about it. They were too weak to defend their borders. And at the same time, they never really tried to integrate the refugees, Palestinian refugees. So
Right.
the Arab countries all have their own interests and considerations on this.
Mhm. So are you following it all that there may be a deal in the works for up to 70, 80 of the hostages? Do you have any thoughts on that? And
It's
also, I
hard to
wanted,
tell. Yeah,
yeah, I wanted,
those negotiations, apparently several tracks are taking place at once. Obviously, on the broadest track, there would presumably be a deal to bring everybody back. But if that involves a ceasefire, then Israel isn't going to accept it. A ceasefire at this point amounts to a Hamas victory.
Mm.
That is, they've inflicted the casualties on Israel, and then they get a go home free card. So that isn't going to happen. And negotiations on specific groups of hostages, well, you can only hope that they have some success. Obviously, Hamas had in mind things along this line.
Yeah. So that brings to mind the first couple hostages that were free. I asked why. Any particular reason they were Americans or who was negotiating with them? I asked that question. I don't know. Why would those hostages released?
Well, in this case, I suppose it was to show that Hamas has a human side to it and that they were willing to release hostages who were either elderly or not Israeli. that it was worthwhile in that sense to negotiate with them, because otherwise the other side might just give up and say, well, Hamas is being unreasonable. Remember, the standard that was set here is a pretty tough one. Israel traded over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners for one Israeli.
Right.
So Hamas is using that as a standard. They would like to see all, I think there's about 7,000 Palestinian prisoners in Israel, including ones who are there for having killed Israelis.
Yeah.
And Israel has never been willing to negotiate their release. So that is probably one of the sticking points in the overall, the really broad negotiation. Right. If there is, in fact, anything on that level, I think what's happening is much more limited negotiations over certain categories.
And who were the negotiators? Qatar or Qatar?
Well, Qatar is serving as an intermediary, apparently, as it has in so many of these negotiations with Hamas. Egypt also has played that role in the past.
Right. So people ask, if we agree that Israel must go in, that there shouldn't be a ceasefire, are there military ways to limit the civilian casualties? Are there more targeted ways to get to the Hamas leaders to try and locate the hostages that would save more Palestinian civilians? What's your response on that?
Well, one has to assume that the Israeli army is seriously trying to limit civilian casualties, because it doesn't do Israel any good to see all the publicity about these casualties. It's Israel's own interest. The truth is that when a force like Hamas melts into the population, and that's their strategy. Their strategy is to blur the distinction between military and civilian as much as they can. Then it really becomes hard to limit the casualties, and international law has not kept up with the realities of this kind of war. So one purpose of going to a ground campaign, of course, was to be able to focus better on the military side, on the military targets, rather than inflicting unintentional civilian casualties. And you have to assume that that's what they're trying to do, and to zero in on the Hamas headquarters, whether they be under a hospital or wherever they may be.
Right. So let's go back to your predictions, because you have a blog. You put it out once a month or every few weeks, Alan?
Well, I try to do it every week.
Okay, it's called Perspective. So Perspective, I think it was 111 on June 21st, 2023. So several months ago, you write, another intifada on the horizon. You predicted that this would happen. Tell us about that. Why?
Well, it wasn't too hard. And in fact, I just read something this morning by Martin Indyk that was written in July. And I'm happy to say that he agrees with me, or it might be better to say I agree with him. But in any event, it was clear that the frustrations were building up, particularly with the government that was installed last December, with the elements from the religious Zionist party, people who really do in some ways count as agitators, that is, people who make no secret about wanting to annex the West Bank and so on, and sort of closing the door on any likelihood of negotiation, of finding a different way out, which would lead a part of the Palestinians simply to give up on any thoughts in that direction and to go back to what they call the armed struggle. It seems to me the Israeli strategy needs to be to convince Palestinians that the armed struggle is a dead end, because it is. But when you don't provide a viable alternative, the Palestinians will resort to that, whether it's a promising avenue or not.
Yeah. So you wrote in that particular perspective that um, the support for a two-state solution by the Palestinians was down to 28%. So let's go back to the origins of that, Alan, with talk about the Oslo Accords and what happened finally until 2007 when they started the blockade of Gaza. At one point, there was a great majority of Palestinians and Israelis in the 70s and 80% who were very hopeful for a two-state solution, but that seems to have evaporated over the last years. Give us the
Well,
history of that.
you're absolutely right. At one point, I think there was around 70% support on both sides. And what happened was that the extremists went to work on both sides. I mean, there was, of course, events like the massacre of the Muslim worshippers in Hebron by Baruch Goldstein, that we can't forget the Jewish extremists here have done their part. But especially in the second intifada that began in late 2000, series of the first intifada wasn't quite as violent. The Palestinians were using nonviolent protests for the most part. The second was much more violent and on purpose, I think, in order to disrupt, to derail the peace process. There was a series just before the Israeli election, in fact, in 2001, and in 1996, obviously a well-planned series of attacks in order to influence the vote in Israel and to make it more extreme. You get this hawkish response, which is a natural human response to these kinds of attacks which took place. So I give credit to the extremists. They have a strategy, and in many ways it works to rouse the hawks on the two sides. Of course, are allies. They see the hawks on the other side as the true face, and they want to expose that face, and they are undermining the moderates on both sides.
So some people may not be aware of the term intifada and what the origins were. Could you just go back for me? I know we're not going to go back to 1948 and 67 and 73, all uh, uh, turmoil when Israel was fighting for her existence against the Arab states. But talk about the Oslo Accords and how they began to develop a program for peace and then how that was disrupted.
Okay, well, the first Intifada started in 1987, and that was more or less a process in which the Palestinians had kind of lost hope in the negotiation. Intifada is a word that means shaking off, but I checked in an Arabic dictionary from before then, and it already was used in political context. In other words, to describe an uprising or something like that. Now, the first Intifada actually had and as I say, it was mostly nonviolent, and it had the impact of making Israelis more open to negotiation, and that led to, in part, to the Oslo Accords in the 90s. And then, as I said, the extremists got to work, and thanks to that, the Oslo process collapsed at the end of the decade. So the second Intifada was much more violent, and I think, as I say, I think explicitly in order to cause anger and reaction among the Israeli public. And in that sense, it worked. Israel turned to the right. It was already headed in that direction, but it turned very much in the hawkish direction.
Okay. So when you refer to the end of the century, that was the Camp David Clinton meetings where
Yeah.
There were offers made about developing a Palestinian state, but it didn't work out.
Well, that was in a way the height of the Oslo process. When the
Mm.
meetings, the first time actually in the history of the conflict in over a century, since the 1880s when the first settlers arrived. This was the first time in 2000, 2001 that serious leadership of the two sides met to talk about the basic issues of the conflict at Camp David and in January 2001 at Taba. And by most accounts, that's the closest they came to resolving the basic issues of the conflict. And again, as I said, this is what brought out the opponents to the process, who managed to derail it.
Well, we had the assassination of Rabin, right? When did that occur? And
That
how
was
did
in
that affect?
1995 at the height of Oslo. Yeah, and in some ways, Yigal Amir, the assassin who killed Rabin, could say today that he had served his purpose in history, because with the assassination of Rabin, that process never really regained its momentum.
So how did in 2007, the blockade of Gaza began? Just, what is that? Describe it. How did it start and what happened?
Well, Hamas had won fair and square an election to the Palestinian legislature in January 2006. This was set up under the Oslo Accords. The Palestinians had autonomy, limited self rule under the Palestinian Authority beginning in 1994. And then in this election in 2006, Hamas actually won a majority of the seats in the Palestinian legislature. Mahmoud Abbas had been elected already as president, and he remained in office. And they made a short effort at a unity government, but it lasted only about a year. And then Hamas, which is, of course, stronger in Gaza than in the West Bank, because Gaza is a much higher percentage of refugees in the population. And they were in a stronger position there. So they simply took over the Gaza Strip. And of course, they've been there in control of it ever since. Number of efforts have been made to reunify the West Bank and Gaza under some kind of Palestinian authority, but it hasn't worked because neither side is going to give up control over the actual fighting forces that it controls. So we've had this division since 2007, and the blockade was the response of Israel, but also, importantly, of Egypt,
Mm.
with the backing of the United States and most Western countries, that Hamas was an illegitimate ruling body in Gaza, and that the blockade would over time weaken it and lead to its ouster. Obviously, after 16 years, we have to conclude that didn't work. And there's a question here about the extent to which the government of Israel under Netanyahu was actually weakening this blockade in order to keep Hamas in power. Now, that's
Right.
controversial because that's
Well,
a
you
very
said
serious
that.
accusation
Yeah.
to make.
You wrote that,
But
Alan, in one of your perspectives.
that's
It
right. And
was called Netanyahu's Design Israel Policy under him. Strong Hamas, was that Netanyahu's design? But then you say that in 2009, Netanyahu did say, I accept the two-state solution, but your thesis is that he worked against it. Describe that.
well, in 2009, he had come back to power after a hiatus, and he was under great pressure to renew the negotiations for a two-state solution. So he went on record in his talk at Bar Ilan, highly conditional, um, lots of reservations, but nevertheless formally committing his government to pursuit of a two-state solution. But, and there's testimony to this effect from people who worked with him during the decade that followed, that he consistently extended a lifeline to Hamas in order to keep the Palestinians divided. I mean, that is a common strategy in cases like this. But this would, of course, avoid the need to negotiate with the Palestinian Authority, with the people on the West Bank, because you could say they didn't speak for all Palestinians. They didn't speak for the Gaza Strip under Hamas. So it relieves Israel of the need to seriously negotiate a two-state solution. And so I think there's a serious question there about the extent to which the Israeli government under Netanyahu was in fact committed to two states and what it was doing in pursuit of that, because there's good evidence that they were allowing cash to get to Hamas. They were, in other ways, the goods that were allowed to arrive through the blockade, allowing some construction materials to reach Hamas, and other accusations like this, which seem to be fairly well founded. And this is now coming out in the internal debate in Israel and will be a part of the election campaign that will probably take place soon after the war ends, I
So
would predict.
you wrote in your blog, you quoted a quote of what Netanyahu actually said. He was in
That's,
favor of the money transfers to Hamas, and that he quoted, "We will foil the establishment of a Palestinian state." Those were his words. And you,
yes,
right?
he's pretty much come down now. Despite what he said in 2009, he's effectively ruled out a Palestinian state, which of course is what the two-state solution is all about. Uh, you can speculate that maybe this war will shake things loose, and that we'll
Right.
get back to some serious consideration of this. I don't see any other real resolution to all of this, except by giving the Palestinians the same thing that Israel rightfully demands for itself. And that is the right of self-determination and the right to have its own nation state. I think, I don't know when, I might not be around. None of us might be around,
Yeah.
but eventually that's what we'll have to get to.
Okay. So one of the other big issues that has been an impediment to more negotiations, the settlement issue. And there are many Israelis who are
Yeah.
living in those settlements who believe in a one Israel, who will not leave. And when they talked about negotiations, they always said the facts on the ground. In other words, you're not getting those areas in the West Bank that we've already
Yeah.
made settlements. Talk about that issue and
Well,
why. What's the
yeah, the settlement issue has become, of course, the big obstacle to a two-state solution, because if you look at the map of the West Bank today, drawing a border between the two sides is exceedingly complex. And there's a group of my fellow academics who have been saying that the two-state solution is no longer viable. I haven't given up on it, but many others have. And they have good arguments on their side, in the sense that drawing a map today separating the Jewish settled areas from others is extremely difficult. There are settlements in the heart of the West Bank. That doesn't mean it's impossible, and there are ways of dealing with that issue that might work, giving the Palestinians empty territory elsewhere, so that things come out more or less in the same area for both states that they would have had with the borders of 49, the armistice lines. There are two other obstacles I think that are more difficult, actually, than the territory. And
Jerusalem?
that is the refugees on one side, because nobody's told the Palestinian refugees, and I'm talking about the ones from 48 and 49, numbering today almost 6 million, registered refugees, most of them, of course, descendants of the original refugees.
Right.
And they are still demanding, by a huge majority, the right to return to wherever their parents or grandparents came from. And that isn't going to happen. No Israeli government is going to open the door to 6 million hostile Palestinians. The other obstacle, and this is on the other side, is Muslim control of the Temple Mount.
Mm.
This is the third holiest site in Islam. Not even the most hawkish Israeli government has considered trying to actually take it over, even though, of course, it's within territory that is controlled by Israel. But to actually stop to end the Muslim control of the third holiest site in Islam just isn't something that any Israeli government's going to do. And how you write that into a final settlement is also quite an issue.
Mm. But I guess people ask, if the two-state solution is not viable, how viable is it for Israel to remain an occupying power and just have this continuing containment policy with outbursts by the Palestinians constantly? How do you relate to that,
Well,
Alan? What's your answer?
I think the criticism is well put. That's exactly the reason that some of us are hoping for a revival of the diplomatic process. I mean, let's get back to, we did have two attempts since Camp David and Taba, two serious attempts, one under Ehud Olmert in the 2007-2008 period, and then the Kerry mission during the Obama administration. Both of these were serious efforts. And I think this war may shake things loose and create a presumption that it's time for another serious effort with the full support, of course, of the United States and Arab countries like Egypt getting on board. With enough international support for it, this may shake things loose more than before. The criticism you mentioned is well taken. I mean, other than that, all the solutions that are being promoted within Israel and within the Jewish community put the Palestinians in an inferior position. And that's not something that they will accept over the long term, any more than Israelis would accept being a minority in an Arab state, with all the disadvantages that would entail. Both national movements, the Jewish and the Palestinians, want to have independence and a state of their own and deserve it.
I hear about, and I hear some proponents like Peter Beinart, I believe, who was active in writing on these issues, talk about a one Israel where both Palestinians and Israelis would share Israel. What is the thinking about that? And is there any purchase for that in the world thinking?
The model that they present is very seductive. I mean, what better thing than having the two peoples being able to cooperate so well that they can live together in the same state and share power? It's a beautiful vision. Unfortunately, the track record of binational states, that's what they're talking about, with nobody dominating anybody, is a pretty poor record. Generally, you only cite two examples of success, Canada and Belgium. And I understand, well, I know Canadians will argue about whether that's a success or not, but nevertheless, all the other attempts at such an arrangement, particularly between parties that have been at war with each other, have fallen flat. I mean, look at Cyprus, look at Bangladesh, and there's a list that goes on and on. So it's a beautiful vision, but trying to imagine how this would really work out is so much more complicated than all the complications of having two states where each party gets actually self-governance and
Yeah.
self-determination.
Yeah. So you wrote in one of your perspectives that crushing Hamas is a one-sided policy, destroy them as a fighting force, but it's not going to destroy them as a political force. And I think about generations of the young Palestinians who are harboring all of the it's propaganda, all of the belief systems. How do we change that? How does that get transformed?
Well, it seems to me that part of the answer has to be providing a better alternative. I mean, it's one thing to use the stick, which we're using now, but you need to have a carrot as well. You need to have an option that makes sense. And sometimes even people who have suffered the most will be the ones to grab a hold of that better alternative. There's an organization that operates between Israelis and Palestinians of precisely families that have had members killed by the other side. That is, it's as close as you can get to the people who are actually suffering from this. And yes, sometimes they become the fanatics of their own side. But in some cases, their reaction has been to say this is not the way and to make common cause with people on the other side who've had the same sort of direct loss, suffering from this. So even though, yes, the younger generation has been through hell and they've suffered from this and probably been radicalized by it, in the long run, and maybe the Irish example here counts because something similar did happen there, that the people who have suffered sometimes can be the ones who make this great transition to a better alternative.
Right. So a couple of other thoughts. You've written about the great power diplomacy that is needed, and you also use the expression "it's time for tough love." So I ask you that, and do you think President Biden is doing in relation to those issues? Is Biden doing a good job to marshal the world's interests and the world's power to help this situation?
Well, in my estimation, he's played it pretty well as far as we can tell. I mean, again, we don't know the content of the private conversations that he has with Prime Minister Netanyahu and others. But the impression is that while he's giving very strong support to Israel's right to defend itself, he is also looking at the long term and trying to push in that direction. Which seems to me to be the right thing to do, to use the American influence, and Israel is dependent on the United States, but to try to, in some cases, even knock heads together to try to get an opening after the war and after all of the stick has been employed to really have a better alternative here, something that the moderates on both sides can get behind and maybe even seize control of the situation.
So, where are the moderates? Who are they? Are there enough of them?
Well, I was encouraged by a poll taken in Gaza, before this war. In fact, the last day of the poll was October 6th, the very day before, in which 72% of the Palestinians in Gaza wanted a peaceful solution to the conflict.
Mm,
The percentage who supported the Hamas line of just armed struggle and nothing else was in the 20s.
mm,
And these are people who are living under the rule of Hamas.
right.
Now, if you did a poll today when they're being bombed by Israel, I'm sure you get different results. But who knows in another year or so, when they're faced with the prospect of ongoing, recurring wars like this, as opposed to a better alternative, then that better alternative can change minds.
Right. So just give us one more example of your time for tough love. Who needs the tough love?
Well, I wouldn't apply it just to Israel. I mean, there's obvious things here with the settlement policy. Every time you expand the settlement, you make resolution of this more difficult and so on. But it has to be applied to the Palestinians too. I mean, the Arab states have to get on board and make it clear to the Palestinians that the armed struggle is a dead end. Israel is here to stay. It's a country of 10 million people. It's got one of the highest standards of living in the world now. It isn't going to go away. And yes, the Palestinians have the same right to self-determination, but they need to come to terms themselves with the implications of a two-state solution, which is Israel's here to stay just as well.
Right. Okay. Um, let's ask about Netanyahu. One of your last perspectives said, "Can Netanyahu survive?" If election were held today, he wouldn't, right? But there's not going to be an election. Why not?
Well, it's wartime, and there's no
Right.
appetite for it in the middle of this campaign, and that's rightfully so. You got
Right.
almost 500,000 people under arms. So the economy is at a standstill. And Israel has this thing about you have to have a 90-day campaign before, which is somewhat ridiculous, but nevertheless that's the procedure that they've been following. But when the fighting ends, 64% of the Israeli public in the last poll wanted to have immediate elections. Immediate, that is 90 days from the
Mhm.
time that they're declared. And it's going to be hard to resist that demand by almost two-thirds of the public. Uh, and so I would imagine that there will be, certainly before 3 years. 3 years is the theoretical time this government could last, but I'm just pretty certain that that isn't going to happen, and that there will be elections fairly soon after the fighting ends.
And a lot of people are calling for Netanyahu's resignation. Even one of the newspapers in Israel that you point out has always supported him. So will he ever resign? I mean, it's been a history of leaders throughout Israeli history who have resigned when they have been marked as having done something against the interests of the country. And don't you think most people will, uh, when there's an proper inquest and investigation, Netanyahu will be faulted for what happened?
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, just in the terms of the immediate preparation, the being caught by surprise and all of the failures on that level. They transferred troops from Gaza to the West Bank not too long before the war, and so on. All of that will come out, and it won't make Netanyahu look very good. He refused to meet with his military people even when they were concerned about this. So that's all going to come out. And beyond that, there's the other thing I mentioned about his policy toward Hamas over the last decade, kind of propping them up. That's going to come out too. So there will be a loud demand. There is now. 76% want him to resign either now or when the fighting ends. And so that will be on the agenda. But I don't see Netanyahu voluntarily resigning. It doesn't seem to be within his character to do that. But they will force elections, and in that case, he has a very poor chance of being reelected.
Well, doesn't it seem though, like we say there are no doves, only hawks in Israel now, when they are faced with an existential threat, even the Israelis turn to the more traditional hawkish uh, parties, right? They seem to.
Well, we'll have to see. As I say, I think
Yeah.
that when the war is over and the costs are high on both sides, that this may shake things loose. Remember, the first Intifada did shake Israelis loose from some of their assumptions. And the 73 war that Syria and Egypt waged against Israel also moved Israeli opinion toward the deal with Egypt that took place just a few years later. So tragedy sometimes brings with it the opportunity for change.
Okay. Well, this has been a terrific conversation for all of us who follow the news, but need someone like you to help us interpret it and understand it even better. And I just want your final thoughts over the next few days, few weeks. What are you looking at? What are you hoping will happen, or what are you thinking? What are your major concerns as this war continues?
Well, I unfortunately don't think it's going to end soon. Um, the examples that we have of this kind of house to house fighting, clearing out a group like Hamas from a densely populated urban environment. The best example recently we have is Mosul in Iraq, and it took 9 months to completely clear ISIS out of this large city. Now, I wouldn't say Gaza is quite comparable, but this house to house fighting in an urban environment, it will take weeks, perhaps months, before Hamas is finished. I do think the Israeli government is determined, as expanded with the Benny Gantz party, with the National Union as part of the war direction. It's got strong support now from a vast majority of the Israeli public, according to the polls. And it will pursue it to this end, but it will take time. And all I would say is that I hope in that time that it does shake things loose in terms of considering how to to give the Palestinians a better alternative than what some of them think that they have.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Alan, for giving us your time and your expertise. And thank you all for watching. We're going to transfer this to YouTube for those who were unable to tune in today. Let's keep watch as what's going on. And thank you so much, and see you all next time on Talk Back. Bye. Bye,
Okay,
Alan. Thank you.
bye. Thank you.